Hello, my name is Chris Snipes, and you are listening to The Melt. I don't even remember where I came across Darren King in the first place. I want to say I heard him on another podcast, but I'm certainly not recalling where that was. I'm experiencing missing time. Um, God, what's new? But it doesn't matter from whence direction he came. The fact is that he arrived, and I started listening to his podcast, which, if you look under ExoAcademian, um, which is one of the names that he goes by, well, besides his name, Darren King, um, online, that's sort of an umbrella for all of his different podcasts that he takes part in. And most of them, first and foremost, have to do with the alien UFO situation and the many facets of that. But he really tackles it in a way that's very fresh and very laden with consciousness, which I think is a very important aspect of this whole puzzle. Um, I'd sort of become bored of the whole topic actually when disclosure started becoming a big thing, and it became so important that we needed the government to tell us again that something exists officially, when really, when have they ever been the official source of any kind of story whatsoever that really is based in reality and not deception? So why am I waiting for gatekeepers to tell me what already exists? I think the nuance that has been lacking in this discussion is the consciousness, really, the consciousness aspect of all of this, and how most likely it is we're not talking about. I mean, I think it's a very strong there's a very strong argument to be had for the fact that we're not dealing with things that are coming from millions and millions of miles away. I think we're dealing with something that perhaps lives on a frequency that is superimposed even over the top of our frequency. I think many frequencies overlap, and some of us are more sensitive and able to see and interact and communicate with these different frequencies, and some of us aren't. I feel like I'm in the latter category, and I'm reaching for the former category. So I'm always open to hearing fresh takes on this whole conversation, and Darren King definitely provides that. He's very, very articulate, gets straight to the point, and he doesn't mince his words at all. Very potent and dense material. It's like Eastern philosophy, the Eastern philosophy of the um, UAP narrative. It's really just you'll see when we get into the conversation, but I wanna thank Darren for agreeing to show up and come on. I figured that he would. He seems like a very open-minded person, and, as it turns out, having a conversation with him, feel that we are on a very similar frequency, speaking of frequencies, so it's always good to come across somebody that you feel there's some overlap with. Not that it's required, but it's a nice, fringe benefit. Anyway, without further ado, let's get to the conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. He will definitely be back, but, the one and only Darren King.
Hi there. How are you?
I'm fantastic. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks.
Good. Good,
Good to
good.
see you.
Likewise. Your
Where are you
power
again? You're
I'm
Central Time somewhere?
I'm in Lawrence, Kansas.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, you're in one of the Carolinas?
Yeah, the very southwestern tip of North Carolina.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Cool, and your weather is better now, I'm assuming?
It's been nice today anyway. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for agreeing to do this. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. I really enjoy all of your podcasts that you put out and that you're on, and, I think you've got some really valuable information, and you take it very seriously, and
Mm,
I respect that. There's so many podcasts that just seems like there's a bong involved, and there's a lot of dude and bro and, like, just
right.
yeah, just kind of like a shooting the shit kind of podcast, but yours are not like that. You really get down to business, and you pack it with lots of dense, useful information. So, I appreciate that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
And, yeah, that is my approach. I mean, I think this is the most important stuff because it gets to the nature of reality. So, I, uh, I pretty much do this with 100% of my time. My work and my play are kind of all fused together around these sort of series of related topics. Yeah.
Uh-huh. Fantastic. And it shows definitely. What does your line of work, if you don't mind me asking, have anything to do with this or
Well, I mean, only in the sense that because I do take it seriously and I take kind of an academic approach, I've been invited to be a part of the Archives of the Impossible at University, which has the Mac archives and the Strieber archives. I've been involved with the John Mack Institute. I often have been privileged enough to get invited to meetings where different UFO organizations and people like Carl Nell and Kirk McConnell are getting together to talk about how to lobby for disclosure sort of collectively. So in that sense, I do a combination of podcasting. I take the consciousness piece as really, really important. And I'm very interested in the transformation of consciousness that this partially represents. So I also do coaching and classes that I offer through my Essence of Being initiative and host retreats and whatnot. So the combination of all those things is kind of the full culmination of the work I do.
Mhm. Yeah, I like the consciousness aspect of that too, because I think if we can't boil it down to something that relates to that, then we're just talking. So
Right.
yeah, I think that the transformation of consciousness is something that's very important, and I love that you work that into everything that you do. So right on.
Yeah, appreciate it. Yeah, and, I don't know how to do anything else at this point. That's kind of my perspective.
Well,
Yeah.
let's start off with assuming that the people watching or listening have not heard of you and don't know who you are. How did you get into all of this, and how did you become so well versed in it?
That is a good question. Whenever I get asked that, I always pause to think about where do I wanna start and how far back do I wanna go, because I think one of the things that inevitably happens is not only do you study the phenomenon and you study these different related topics, but to some degree, you feel like you've been drawn into it. So there raises this question around what was the seed? What was the inception point? On the one hand, I had an anomalous experience with my ex-wife about 20 years ago. That was my first experience of something that just didn't fit with conventional understandings of reality at all. And for a long time, I didn't know what to do with it. Neither did she. We were lucky in the fact that we both saw this, and so that grounds it in reality for you. And I think otherwise I might have really wondered the next day how it had happened, if it was a dream or whatever. But that was my first sort of firsthand experience with something that cannot be explained by conventional logic. And then around the time that the famous New York Times article came out, I really dove in even more so, and then I began to recognize when I studied the lore that some of what I had experienced was actually common as part of the UFO phenomenon, and that kind of looped me fully in, and at first I was doing the podcast part-time while I was doing something else, and it kind of blew up and became kind of a vocation, and since around 2023, I've been doing it full time in addition to the Essence of Being initiative that I started, which is about the consciousness development piece and coaching and retreats. But yeah, I think when I think back to it, I would even go back further if I, really wanted to pick an origin point. I remember being totally fascinated with Whitley Strieber's books in high school and was gobbling up those books, and I remember my friends wondering why I was so fascinated with this, and I don't really know why I was so fascinated with it, but I have always been deeply interested in the topic, and it was over the last 10 years or so that it really kicked into a different gear.
Was the experience with your ex-wife the first one that you've had?
The first one of that nature, I mean, I've had other things happen that are hard to understand what happened exactly, but this one was an experience where we woke up in the early morning hours in a hotel. At the time, we were moving across the country from Tennessee to Washington State, and there was a female entity at the end of our bed. Our just turned 3-year-old daughter was in the bed next to us, and my wife was pregnant with our son at the time. So I saw this female entity and at first was confused. You don't immediately know what to do with the fact that there's a human like being at the end of the bed. I got out of the bed, and then the being turned towards me seemed surprised that we could see her. At this point, I didn't realize my wife was seeing it as well. And I started moving towards the entity, and I registered it as what looked like surprise, whether we were not supposed to be awake or we were not supposed to be able to see, I don't know. But then the entity backed up towards the wall while watching me and then passed right through the wall. And then I turned around and did something that made no sense at the time. And this is partly why it was so confounding at the time. Only later did I realize it's actually quite common that I turned around and come right back to bed as if nothing strange had happened,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah, yeah.
And would have gone to sleep, except that my ex-wife saw it as well, and she shook me out of my stupor, said, "What are you doing going back to sleep after that?" We talked it over, woke up our daughter who had these strange welts all over her body,
Hmm.
which within about an hour of being out on the road, they completely disappeared and cleared up. So we talked it over, decided we weren't gonna stick around, hit the road, and that was really the only kind of experience of that nature in a fully waking state where someone else saw it as well, and we confirmed it with each other. So that grounded it in a reality that other experiences I've had are definitely anomalous, but not as grounded in the everyday as that was with having someone else there.
Mhm. And so the other ones have been more personal, just you and whatever it is you're experiencing.
Yeah, and then also questions around what state of consciousness you're in.
Mhm.
Dreams that feel like they're more than normal dreams, experiences in the hypnagogic and hypnopompic state, so just between falling asleep and going, and being awake and coming back out again, which, in doing a lot of research since then and really, really wrestling with what are the natures of these experiences, I have come to the strong sort of leaning that our day-to-day waking state consciousness is configured for a certain kind of experience. And other kinds of states of being are just as valid and often will tap us into different things. And so I take those things seriously, but they weren't in the day to day waking experience to the same degree that weren't as discombobulating as that one was.
Can you allude to the nature of any of these experiences, or like what kind of stuff did it involve, or the ones that were you, it was just you and whatever you were experiencing?
There are times where I feel like I'm flashing into other reality scapes, other whether it's other lifetimes I've lived or other lives. I think there's an interesting question around because of experiences I've had since then with a protocol that I use that is designed to actually take me out of the default mode of consciousness. You have this experience of how you define yourself changes fully. And I've had experiences where I'm no longer Darren, but I still have a sense of I amness that doesn't go away. And usually in those states, I have a much more expansive understanding of who I am. So in those moments, I feel like I'm either revisiting past experiences or dialing into and dropping into other people's consciousness or something else entirely. But they have been mostly experiences that feel familiar somehow, but they're not familiar based on here.
Mhm.
So I haven't known what to do with them. But I've had experiences and a sense of having a more expansive, right on the tip of my tongue kind of understanding of something that I am or that I know beyond this, but it's hard to ground it into logic. And then one of the things I've I've attempted to do more and more over time is when I use this protocol to sort of exit the construct, as I call it, I have worked on different ways that I can try to translate when I come back in so that I can hold on to it more because the nature by which you know things is different and it's not linguistic, it's not linear. And so you have to find other placeholders to hold on to these kinds of things, and you're doing some degree of translation. But that tells me that this is just one particular way of experiencing reality, and there's many others as well.
Mhm. Are these experiences spontaneous, or do you set a protocol? It makes it sound as if you sit down to initiate them.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I use a series of inputs to reconfigure my consciousness. I don't talk about details just because I it can be psychologically and physically dangerous if you do it incorrectly,
Mhm.
and you have to have done a lot of grounding beforehand, so I don't talk about the specifics, but there are a series of things I do over a couple of days, to have the full experience, and yes, it's very much deliberate. It's a very specific protocol I follow, and while the experience is different every time, you fully leave any sort of grounding in this particular reality, and even your sense of who you are, basically becomes completely transcended. And then, especially in the most recent experience I had, when you come back in, it can be very, very discombobulating because you go from an experience of reality that feels everything is simultaneous and happening at the same time. There's complete vision in all directions at all times. There's no fall off in terms of the granularity of vision. You can look in every direction and know everything at the same time. And you know things through a kind of gnosis that I've talked about, which is a direct kind of structural understanding. And so this is why I say here we tend to think the world is separate from us and we perceive it that way. And we think that we reason about things to come to conclusions. And these kinds of experiences, structure and meaning are sort of two sides of the same coin. And you feel like as you're experiencing and witnessing structure, you are understanding meaning. And it's much more foundational in its feeling. It's like a near-death experience where they talk about it being more real than real.
Yeah, yeah.
Absolutely true.
Mhm.
And it's a kind of knowing that has no parallel here really at all, because it's not reasoning, it's not rationality, it's trans-rational. And so when you come back in, you actually have to relearn and readjust and reorient to the way that we actually navigate here. And I tell this kind of funny story one time where I came back in and you're still kind of clunkily trying to remember to mechanically do one thing after another. And I knew that I wanted to read something and I wanted to take a sip of coffee. And instead I proceeded to pick up my coffee and poured it right into my glasses because my brain just didn't know to separate those things out. So it's
Yeah,
kind of clunky when you come back in.
interesting. These protocols, did you sort of assemble them yourself, or did you find it in a book or a tome, or did you receive it from some other place?
It's a combination of all those. I have very specific elements that I have not come across before, that I kinda just had a hunch would be helpful, combined with some other things that people have historically done as well, and fine-tuned it over time because I would try different things, see what would happen, and then over time, you know, crafted it so that it would have, the fullness of this experience, and as I became more comfortable that I would come back and that I could handle this, I would do more extreme versions of it, to the point where the last one was extremely profound and fundamentally changes well, several of them have done this, but that last one especially fundamentally changes the way you understand reality and understand who we are actually, and even understand things like NHI. And the coming back in, that time was even more discombobulating because you are basically almost like software installations stacking identity after identity after identity to get back to who you are as a body mind, as a human being in this particular era. And rather than them being sort of distributed across space time, which is like one of the configurations in this particular reality, they all have to be slammed together one after another. So you have this experience of coming to and then thinking about what you are, and then suddenly that will kick off the next instantiation, installation, and it kind of happens one after another where you feel like you're having this really overwhelming visceral experience where you are remembering being original consciousness, where you are remembering being the notion of a humanoid bipedal being. You're remembering being the notion of a human being. You're remembering being someone from, a particular point in time in a certain place. And when you finally get to the point where I actually was at that point up and walking around, but still had no fixed sense that I was Darren at that point. I really was able to, at arm's length, as if someone had given me a folder and said, "Here's a file on someone named Darren if you're interested." And I had no emotional connection to it. It was
Huh.
fascinating. It's a truly profound moment because everyone here worries so much about death. They worry so much about what part of me am I gonna lose?
Mhm.
But in this sense, the biography of Darren was just a bunch of ideas that had been sort of overlaid on top of all these other instantiations of consciousness. So that fundamentally changed how I think about it. But yeah, to answer your larger question there, it's a very specific protocol that I crafted over time, and I've adjusted it as I've had more of the experiences.
Mhm. When I've heard you describe what you just described before in various different ways, it has reminded me of when the, McKenna brothers were in La Chorrera. I don't know if you've read True Hallucinations. I would
I
imagine you
have, yeah.
have, of course.
Yeah.
Um, and when he kind of goes Dennis kind of goes off planet, or I don't know even know how to describe what happened to him, and he probably doesn't know either. It seemed like he was experiencing, like, zooming out almost as far as you possibly can, like, beyond himself, beyond the planet, beyond maybe our galaxy, beyond maybe the specific area of the universe that we were in, and during the, I believe, 2 weeks that it took him to sort of reintegrate with reality, uh, he was just a process basically of zooming back into his
Yeah.
self and his identity. Does that ring true?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really hard to describe to people adequately how much scope you're exposed to. And that's why zooming is a good way to think about it, because it's not so much that you're counting not just worlds, but realities, different realities that you're aware of. You're not counting them. It's like you get a quick snapshot and there's quadrillions and you're aware of all of them. And they're all different. They all have different, modes of physics and very, very different ways that beings even experience themselves. And you just become aware of all of that because basically what I've come to understand, and this fits with, again, ancient non-dual traditions and channeling groups have talked about this, new age groups have talked about this, the UFO phenomenon beings have talked about this, the sense that we're all actually the same consciousness, kind of constrained into a certain narrow frame of who we think we are. And when you have this experience, it obliterates those boundaries. And so the feeling of I amness never goes away. It just is much more expansive. And you understand things like, for instance, I had this experience one time where after I came out, I went to flip on a light switch, this light right here, actually, and immediately had this memory of why we chose light as a dynamic parameter of experience. And it was as if one was, "Oh, yeah, and let's not forget why we created light to begin with." And and I remember being shocked, and I had to sit down. I said, "What did I just think to myself?" But this is what happens is that the usual walls that define who you are now are porous, even after you come back, and that's been my experience. And so sometimes when I'm just driving, I'll see something that reminds me of something in a reality scape that is not here. So it's fascinating, and it tells me that for good reason, I think we're having a very constrained particular experience, so we can have this particular kind of experience, but it's just the tiniest fraction of what we truly are and what we actually have access to.
Would you say these different realities are, I mean, it may be silly to try and constrain it to a certain syntax or certain kind of word, but dimensions, frequencies? How are they places, or
Right.
how would you apprehend that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that because you do know these things. That's again what I wanna really emphasize is that it's not like you're going around asking the beings, "Hey, what's the nature of reality and how does this work exactly?" Like, you have direct access to it because you are the structure of which you're experiencing as well as being a being having that experience within that structure. That's what's fascinating. But yeah, you have this sense, and this, of course, is, supported by the revelations in quantum mechanics about entanglement, about non-locality, all these things we understand now that demonstrate that space-time can't be foundational, which is to say it's more like a presentation layer. So in that sense, they're not places, they're more like modes of being. So by reconfiguring your consciousness, which yeah, you can think about like a radio station, the radio is not producing your consciousness, it's just attenuating a radio wave.
Yeah.
And we're used to being stuck on 104.9 our entire lives. And it turns out you can turn this dial and tune into these different realities. And you're just as much that as anything else. But I think using the analogy of frequency is very helpful. And not even just in terms of what we think of as space, but also in terms of what we think of as time. Because I also, in these experiences, have a much more pliable and expansive ability to know things, to have awarenesses about my past that I didn't have prior to this. Almost like there's a witnessing aspect of me, the higher self, if you will, that's watching the experiences when I was 10 years old. And now I can access that about my memory of being a 10-year-old. Or I'll have senses. And over time, I begin to be able to recognize that that particular feeling, that sensibility is usually something to do with the future. And I will have senses of where things are going to go in the future as well. And that has actually panned out. And, one of which is, 2 times ago, I had an experience of seeing something in my future, and we'll see, if it pans out, but I have a strong sense that it will. And again, what's fascinating about that is as much as some people might think that sounds fantastical, we understand, going back to Einstein and plenty of work since then, that it's largely an illusion, this kind of linearity of time
Yeah.
and this the future being separate than the past. And even with the notion of the block universe, everything's already happened. And so you have this sense that, it's sort of like being you one part of you is on a road walking, and so you can only see what's directly in front of you as far as the next turn. But another aspect of you is 30,000 feet up in the air and can see the entire terrain that you're going to pass across, 6 months from now. And you simultaneously are both those things. You're just usually constrained out of that more expansive understanding.
Sometimes when people think that, or they do the math in their mind about being able to see into the future, that translates to them as if everything, like, it's all predestined. There's no free will. There's no navigating into different realities or anything like that. Whereas I think that it's more like and I'm completely just as conjecture because I don't have any personal experience that I know of in this, but. Uh, is it more that you're just sort of getting a wormhole glimpse into a possibility or something? How do you perceive that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think that what people wrestle with that question is they assume that they are one specific thing. And so then they ask the question of free will from that perspective. But I would say that that is more like a constrained possibility space. Just like if you go and hide in a closet and close the door, you can't see much of what's going on. But that doesn't mean that some part of you can't be both outside of the closet and within the closet. And so, in this sense, there is an aspect of us that is completely outside of space time. And the reason why I would want to emphasize space time is because we wrestle with, is there free will? And we think about that in terms of a linear timeline, right? There's things that happen in the past and the present and the future, and there's this cause and effect, and it has to happen in this order all the time. So when we have experiences of our future, that throws off that sense of linearity and causality. But we already know, again, from revelations of quantum mechanics that that's not really how things work, that, probabilities are better a better description than this literal kind of causality. And so outside of the construct, you experience things in a completely different way. So rather than event A happen, then B, then C, instead, you might have A to Z that have been reorganized by meaning and semantic structure. So, what happened when I came back is that I would be aware of the events of my life and they would completely reorder based on how they were semantically connected. So, it might be something when I was 5 years old and 25 and 38 and something that happened yesterday. And they were actually more closely clustered together because they were part of the same meaning extension. And so, in that sense, the whole notion that we are being walking on a line through time is the illusion. So we do have free will, but it's not that linear step by step kind of causality free will. It's more like a roaming consciousness that connects to other parts of reality through intention. And then this reality is one particular way that maps out. So, in the same way that you might take one kind of map and translate it into a different kind of map with a different scale and a different kind of key, and different things mean different things. You might have a topographic map, right, where you're looking at elevation, another map that you're just trying to understand east, west, north, south. So in a sense, our walking through linear space-time is just a map of a much more multifaceted, multidimensional reality. And in that sense, we do have free will, but the deepest free will is not here. It's the aspect of us that's outside of space-time.
Mhm. Yeah, I have a hard time, admittedly, because I don't have a whole lot of I feel sort of spiritually thick in a lot of ways. I feel very
Mm,
open-minded to so many things,
right,
but I
right.
feel like there's this illusionary wall that I have, and I really don't want it to be there, and I would like to, and I've tried various things throughout my life to try and get past it, and I've glimpsed things, but it doesn't seem to be to the extent that you're experiencing them. Is there any way oh, maybe one thing that I have a hard time wrapping my mind around is the nonlinearity of time. Is there any way at all to articulate that if you haven't experienced it?
Well, in the same way that a map takes a much more complex reality and deliberately reduces it, and it reduces the complexity so it's navigable in a certain kind of way. Another map will translate in a completely different way depending on what you wanna do, right? If you want to go for a hike and you wanna check out what the elevation is on Mount Baker, then you wanna have very different information than trying to figure out how far Seattle is from Portland or something. Very different kind of question. And so the linearity is just one kind of map, and it is hard to describe, mm, mm, but the important point to point out is that it's not just that you can grok it when you're outside the construct, but you realize it's more primary, actually. It's more primary to know things by relationship than by how they filter across space and time. There is no space and time in that experience, and you will sometimes see a kind of superstructure of all these different realities, and you might and it's incredibly granular, like, everywhere you look, every, like, most minute space has incredible granularity of an entire reality scape, not a world, but an entire reality scape, and if you look there, boom, then you zoom in and you're in that reality, and there's no time that it takes to get there, and you can keep doing this, and like I said, with the aspect of understanding as a first person experience why light was chosen as a particular parameter of experience and all the things that it would make available. What you're experiencing there is not just the free will of a being, you're experiencing the free will of original mind, right? You literally are, and then I always make this point. I don't just mean it metaphorically or kind of poetically. You have the experience of the part of you that's well upstream of being human. and it's completely different. But at the same time, it feels completely normal when you're there. When you come back, you're like, "Wow, that was a really alien experience compared to this." But from that vantage point, this feels quite alien and very, very limiting as well. So, it's not so much about the order that things happen in that experience, it's more how important they are. Their significance determines how they relate, not spatial, not temporal kind of understanding.
Okay.
And
Okay.
that's why when I came back and I go to flip a light switch, suddenly, because of the meaning connection, right, I had that awareness of light because one connects to the other as a cluster.
Mhm.
And, I sometimes use the analogy of because I have a background in software engineering and with artificial intelligence, you're not only linking all these ideas together, but you're also holding the relationships between different things in different dimensionalities. So cat and dog would have a certain relationship, and then bone would have another relationship that relates to both cat and dog, but it has another meaning for dog, like chasing a bone. And so that's held in a different space, if you will, dimensionally. But they all are like a cluster of relationships. And what AI has to do really quickly is figure out which relationship you're asking about, right? You can't just do it by words because words have different meanings and connotations depending on the context. So in the same way, usually here we're limited for good reason to a certain experience set that's tied to memories from this lifetime, and it runs from past to future. But in that expansive state, not only does it not run from past to future, it runs by meaning connection, but there is no border. And so you can find yourself in completely different realities just by an intention that you hold in a moment.
I think that's one of the things when I visualize, everything happening at once. I have a hard time because I wanna picture, for instance, different decades in my life. We'll just categorize it by decades, and they're stacked or they're superimposed over one another, and they're all happening simultaneously. And then I get lost because it's like I wanna picture them as time loops that start and end at a particular time, but that doesn't fit with the what you're describing either because it's
Right.
limiting it's like taking a segment of time. It's yeah, my mind falls short in grasping it, but I know it's only because I either haven't experienced it or I don't remember experiencing it, which is probably more
Right.
likely the case.
Right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense to me.
Yes.
And the good news is, I think for everyone, is when you do eventually experience it or remember it, it feels as natural, if not more natural. It feels more natural than this. This feels like an abstraction, actually, once you come
Sure.
back to it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like this state of mind could be very, discombobulating, as you have mentioned. So it is good to have a protocol where there is a beginning, middle, and an end, and then you can sort of reintegrate. Do any of those states of mind or states of being ever happen spontaneously? Have they ever just sort of peeped out of no place and arose without calling them forth?
Yes, and more so since I've been using the protocol,
Mhm.
because I think some people's consciousness is more porous than others. And I say porous because, again, what psi points to is that everything's actually connected, and it's only, and again, quantum mechanics points to this as well. It's only the appearance that makes it look like things are not one thing, not ultimately connected. And so because of that, at certain points, some sort of trigger will take me out of the usual experience set. So another example I like to give is one day I was driving home, and it was at the time of year, sort of the autumn kind of time of year where the sun was setting, it was dusk, it was that kind of golden light, and it was hitting this reed in this pond as I was stopped at a stoplight. I remember looking over at the reed, and I said in my mind, "Oh, that's like how it is on the other side, just like that." And then I caught myself saying, "What did I just say?" And you're literally having, like, commentary about your own experience, and you're catching yourself realizing that you're drawing a memory, which is it's more like an association. You're drawing an association, but your association set is much broader than it used to be. So absolutely these things happen spontaneously, and like I say, it often can happen either through some event that's evocative in some way that has some sort of semantic connection to something else, the same way that you might hear a song and it takes you right back to the first time you heard that song or something. It's like that, but there's many more of those triggers. And like I say, also in states like the hypnagogic and the hypnopompic, when you're dropping out of the default mode just before you go to sleep, it's like the usual noise, right, of your mind state that is front and center drops away, and in that moment, I think your consciousness naturally expands, and you'll find yourself having experience like a few nights ago, I had an experience where very vividly, I was looking at this dark hardwood floor on in an apartment building with these glass, full glass wall basically overlooking Manhattan, and, I don't know whose apartment it was, I don't know when this was, but I was fully able to just stop myself and say, "Okay, hold this space. I'm in an apartment, I can see the grain of the wood, I can see Manhattan in front of me," and then you hold this moment where you're like, "Okay, whose experience is this? When is this? Where is this?" Yeah, it's fascinating, but I do find myself spontaneously popping into different modes, yeah.
But it's never been something that's been disturbing or has brought you unease.
No, I mean, that's something that's interesting too, because I think that when I mentioned earlier that one of the reasons I don't mention the details of the protocol is because I do think it matters that you have become very energetically clear on your intention. And people might think that sounds obvious, like everybody wants to have a good experience. But if, for instance, you've had a moment in time earlier in the day when you got stuck in traffic and you're really frustrated with someone, or you have a memory of a disagreement with someone earlier in the day, that kind of negative residual energy gets amplified in these other states. And
Yep.
so when I recommend people that are going to try C5 or HICE or lucid dreaming or whatever it is, even meditation, I encourage people to first learn how to do that inventory. And it's not just mental, it's not just what thoughts are in my mind right now, but you learn, and again, this is tricky to describe because it's more caught than taught, but you begin to experience things by the kind of energetic wavelength, and you can feel if there's a residual kind of energy that is tending towards negativity. And so I would always want to make sure I've cleared that up before I go into these experiences. So I think people who have not done that or haven't known to do that, or people have had, for instance, a lot of trauma in their life and haven't processed that and haven't done shadow work, then that will absolutely populate into these other modes of reality. And I think this speaks to the fact that we are co-authors of all these different realities as well, because it's the one original mind streaming into these different avatars. So we have to take seriously that when we're traveling, we're not just passive observers. We're constructors of the experience as well. And so, in that sense, I take that very seriously. But for the most part, my experiences, while sometimes overwhelming physiologically and just in terms of the visuals you're seeing, they've never really been scary. I've had experiences where something is coming at me with information and it's coming so assertively, right? So there's an example too, we have to watch your own interpretation. First time I experienced this, I said, wow, why is this being so aggressive trying to pass me information? But number one, you don't have your usual boundaries of self. So it feels like code or information is coming straight into your visual field, like right in front of your eyes. And so your memory of having body boundaries kind
Mm,
of gets reactive about that.
yeah, yeah.
So first you get used to that. There is no border of a body, so it just comes straight in. But then secondly, I'm like, it's assertive, but it's not aggressive. Aggressive is an after the fact interpretation. So I've learned to be very proactive about trying to clean out any of the distortions, any of the overlays of interpretation I would bring. There have been times where I'm in my periphery, kind of aware of beings that are operating what you might call like a lower frequency. It's like a denser kind of energy. And I just know to just steer clear of that and not give it attention. But I haven't found that anything negative has happened to me. I know others have, but I haven't. But I'm also very, very particular about preparation. Yeah.
That's good. Yeah, just like, it's not a good idea to recommend that everybody do mushrooms. Like, not everybody is ready to do mushrooms, like, maybe
Right.
legalizing them is not the way to go, or maybe there should be some sort of, what's the word? Vetting process. Yeah, I don't know what that would be, but
Right.
yeah, it's good to be in a centered, grounded place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know that there are in states where, there is more openness to this, like Colorado and Oregon and whatnot.
Mhm.
You can sign up for retreats, right? Psilocybin retreats where there will be guides there, there will be therapists there that are preparing you beforehand. They're doing kind of an inventory with you before you go in. They're there to talk you through coming back in and reintegrating.
Oh, that's
I
good.
think those kinds of preparations are important.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I have heard you refer to the construct many times, and I can think of a lot of different ways that I would define that, but I'm wondering what you mean by that. Some would say, probably go, oh, he means a simulation, or maybe the physical world. But I'm thinking it's probably a little more intricate than that. Could you let us know what you mean by the construct?
Yeah, so I would say that number one, I think metaphors and analogies are often helpful to get people part of the way. And so I think when people think about a movie like The Matrix, that becomes a corollary that they can think about. Okay, I remember that movie where everybody thought they were walking around in the real world, but it wasn't ultimately real, right? It was a re-representation. In that sense, it was like a digital re-representation. And I also am careful to distinguish this from what some people mean when they say the simulation.
Mhm.
So that's why I use this word construct as opposed to simulation or matrix, because my understanding, and this was my understanding even before having these experiences, just from my non dual studies and whatnot. But in non dual teaching, which goes back thousands of years and was developed based on human beings tapping into these deeper levels and exploring them and developing understandings of reality based on it, that there is this sense of original mind or pure awareness. And within that pure awareness arises the myriad things, the 10,000 things, the objects and the people and the forms. All of that is downstream as a kind of dreamscape of what this mind dreams up. And I, often think about this in terms of I also lucid dream. And I had an experience with a lucid dream where I was in this reality where I was in this strange house and I went down these stairs and around the corner and I saw this really intricate, majestic kind of purple blue wall that was finely woven. It was like a fabric wall. And I went right up to it and I could touch the fabric and I could feel and I could smell the fabric and I could see all the designs intricately um, working its way through this entire fabric. And I remember thinking to myself, who did this? Because in that moment, it's just as viscerally real as everything we experience here. And yet you're supposedly in a dream. So, in that sense, because I've had many of these different kinds of experiences, what it fundamentally does is it changes your understanding of what this is. So when people are asking me, what is that experience? Well, I would say, well, first thing you need to ask yourself is, what is this? Because we have kind of become habituated into thinking this is base reality. And again, already quantum mechanics is telling us it's not. Like that is not a question at this point. So I think the first thing people need to reckon with is really take seriously the revelations, the implications of quantum mechanics, and recognize that we know now that they're not really even subatomic particles. There's just a unit of field of which sometimes excitations form that create the appearance of subatomic particles that build all of our objects and people and experiences and distances and everything. The reason why quantum entanglement works, that two particles entangled on opposite ends of the cosmos will simultaneously reorient based on what the other one does, which seemingly violates this notion that you could send a signal faster than the speed of light. But what it's basically proving is that the speed of light is only a boundary within the construct of space-time, and space-time is not ultimately real. That's why entangled objects violate that, because actually it's just the appearance
Mm,
that
yeah.
is that bounded set. So
Mhm.
in that sense, everything we experience here, the sense of being a separate self apart from other people, the sense of distances, the sense of solidity, the sense that I am the experience being produced by my brain sort of interacting with my body, all of that is exposed as a presentation layer. And it's not, again, it's not that you think you sit down and you start writing out equations and trying to figure this out. You just immediately know when you're at that deeper level, you see the structure for the first time as a structure. So usually we're embedded within, but in this sense you are outside of it. And so you know this reality as a construct. You see how it's constraining the larger reality in a very specific way to produce a very specific kind of experience. So that's what I mean when I say construct. All of the familiarity here of space, separate objects, things flowing through time, causal ordering, all of that is only conditionally real. I don't like to
Mhm.
say it's not real.
Yeah.
It's a very specific way that consciousness itself is constraining its own awareness so as to create a certain kind of experience, just like when you choose to read a book versus watch a movie or go for a walk in the park, you're choosing different experiences based on how you're interacting with your consciousness. Well, all of the parameters of this experience are just one of those.
Mhm. So do you think that the construct is constrained to physicality, or does it is it bigger than that? Does that
Yeah, and
make
this
any
is one of the
sense?
things I would say that, I'm almost finished writing this book right now, and one of the chapters is titled "Why This Is," and then in brackets, "Not a Computer Simulation."
Hmm.
Because I think because of our assumptions and because of our habits and the way that we've all been brought up in Western society, we're so used to believing that physicality is real and that physicality is the base groundedness of which we evaluate things, that we assume, even when we start seeing evidence through quantum mechanics, through astronomy, through the holographic principle, that this is not actually physical, we still assume, well, then there must be some other physical reality that's simulating this one. That again is sort of like that assumption that we can't let go of, that habit we can't break. But when you have this experience outside the construct, you realize that all realities, which is to say, any experience you have where things are arising in your awareness, that's always virtual in
Mhm.
every kind of reality scape. So when I was aware of myriad realities, they're all virtual. They're all dreamscapes, right? It's like me asking you, that dream you had 3 nights ago, where was that? And you'd be like, that's a category error. I'm not sure what you mean. I'm like, "Well, just tell me how to get there. Or what direction do I go?" And you're
Exactly.
like, "This is dream. It doesn't make any sense."
Uh-huh.
That's what all these realities are, right? So, um, in that sense, it's not simulated on something that is actually physical and therefore real. It's a particular way that, just like when you go to make a meal, rather than just taking every ingredient you have in the kitchen and throwing it all together, you're like, I'm going to make Mexican, or I'm going to make Indian, or I'm going to make pizza. In the same way, these different realities we experience are taking particular ingredients and combining them in certain ways to create a certain kind of experience.
Okay. I can abide by that. Um, so do you going back to dreams as you brought them up, and what you're saying about maps, I'm just gonna word this precariously, knowing that it's silly to word it this way, but are dreams a place? Meaning, do you think that there's some objective reality, for lack of a better term, of a dream, or is it all mental manifestation? But I mean, by that definition, you're gonna say everything is mental
Right.
manifestation, but yeah.
Right.
So maybe I
Right.
answered my own question, I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I would look at, like, say if you have a Shakespearean theater, and someone says, "Oh, this is where King Lear's castle is," right? It's like, well, in this play it is, right? But next week we're gonna do Romeo and Juliet, and it'll be some other place entirely, right? In Italy or something.
Mhm.
So in that sense, yeah, there is no space where one thing is relative to another other than in that constrained particular reality. So, um, I understand it's difficult to fully grok that because it's so outside of our usual experience here. But but in that experience, you recognize that everything is relative to everything else, and that's why I use terms like construct and virtual reality, but I don't mean virtual in the way that we do, where we assume we're in base reality and we can play Grand Theft Auto or something. I'm saying that Grand Theft Auto is just another layer of abstraction of a realityscape that's already an abstraction. But it's also not unreal because all there is sort of ultimately is this grounded awareness, right? This pure awareness of which all potentiality is there. Nothing's missing. But nothing's also arising because nothing's differentiating, right? So it's the same way that, in the non-dual traditions, they talk about without light, you have no sense of darkness, right? Without cold, you have no sense of heat. So in that pure awareness, it's just a whiteout of all potentiality. And so to have anything arise as an experience, you have to differentiate. And to differentiate, you have to constrain out of that totality into something where I'm going to choose, I'm going to make Mexican tonight. I'm going to make Indian food and I will choose different things. And so in that sense, they're still real, because the ingredients that make Indian food and Mexican food are part of the totality, but you're very specifically constraining which ones you're gonna use so that you can have one particular kind of experience over another.
Mhm. Yeah, that makes sense. Um, would it be a misconception from where you're coming from to see maybe physical, quote unquote, reality as some sort of a training place? Like people speak of manifestation and that we manifest our experience through our consciousness, but it seems like there's some filters as far as what it seems that we can do in this on this plane of existence, whereas once you leave the construct or leave your body or go to the astral plane, however you want to define that, it becomes very easy to manifest things. Like you see it. I mean, that's a lot about what the Tibetan Book of the Dead is like, just be aware that once you leave your body, everything that you see, you're manifesting. So
Yeah,
be aware of that, make that connection, and then you can guide your experience. So
right,
do you see this as a sort of a training place to do that, or how do you see it?
right. Yeah, and just to follow up with what you were saying there, often in out-of-body experiences or astral journeys, people will be surprised that they have a body. They look down and they can see a hand as they're floating around, until at one moment it disappears because they realize they're no longer projecting it from their mentation, right? So even there, you realize that as long as you think some part of you thinks you need that, you will continue to project that, but eventually you lose that as well. Yes, I would say that a wholehearted yes to what you asked there, because I think that one of the, I don't want to say disadvantages, but differences in that undifferentiated place is there's no resistance training. So in the same way that when someone goes into orbit around the planet and they start losing muscle mass really quickly because they're not pushing against gravity, and so their muscles are not being worked out, and so the muscles don't just stay as they were, they begin to atrophy, right? And you've probably seen sometimes astronauts come back and they're standing at a podium and they collapse, where
Mhm.
someone has to hold them up because they're just not used to having to hold themselves up.
Yeah.
Here we become completely habituated. This is what we do all the time. So in the sense that this works, is the way I understand it, is very much it's like a school, and that in the same way that I talked about this in the most recent liminal frames. If you're a team and you're having your practice squad against another practice squad, there's a certain degree of intensity, but it's not going to be the same as a game day situation where you're actually playing another team. And you say if you've had an injury, you don't really know how healed that is until you're in game day action, right?
Yes.
And you're
Yes.
fully letting it happen. I would say that this experience is like that, that here, because we do believe and experience each other as different and separate, and we feel like we're battling each other for finite resources, and we believe that it's a bad thing if I die and I have to at all costs try to prevent that from happening. All those things are to some degree illusions, but they're purposeful illusions because they teach us how to work with energy. And if we came in knowing this was all a dreamscape and like that it could be over, it's difficult to take as seriously the resistances we feel. So I would say that the ideal in some ways is that you spend the first part of your life really believing this is kind of all there is, or at least to a degree that you take seriously and you work and you navigate how to balance your needs with other people's needs and you try to find a way to work with these different conditions you experience here. But ideally, at some point, you begin to wake up and remember that this isn't quite what it seems, but you've by then done the work to work with the energy. Because again, in the non-dual traditions and some of the channeling traditions, there will be people or entities that remember being kind of a disembodied being, not having corporeal form. And it, on the one hand, being kind of like a lazy Sunday afternoon sitting on the couch when there's a storm outside that you can just be apart from. But you can only do that for so many days before you wanna get up and do something else, and you actually want to have the experience of being out in the storm and resistance, and I'm cold and I wanna get inside, I need to put on a jacket. So, the only way that you it's the same thing when when we raise children, you can sit them down and talk to them all day long about what they should do in life. But until they get out there, like I remember with my son, I remember teaching him how to ride a bike, and for the first several days he'd gone out, we'd been in mostly flat places, even though I had taught him how to use his brakes. But one day we went out and there was this, hill that we were going down, and I'm like, "Ezra, use your brakes," but he had sort of trained himself to not need to brake, so he could just, like, ride it out. But he ended up crashing into the trees, he was fine, but it's because he had not yet had the experience of, "Okay, things don't go so well when you don't use your brakes." And so those are the energetic inputs that we learn to work with here. And so in that sense, I think that um, not only is this illusory, but it's purposefully illusory as
Mhm.
a kind of school
Yeah.
that makes us work with the energy directly and makes us through trial and error, just like we learn how to ride a bike by crashing a few times and whatnot until it eventually becomes second nature. In the same way as we grow up and learn how to make sure that I'm not taking advantage of someone else so that I get something, how we try to create laws that benefit and balance the needs of the entire society. All of these are ways that we are working ourselves back to the awareness of everything being connected. But the experience of this is to learn directly and very viscerally how to work with energy. Because as I sometimes say in my classes, it's one thing when you're sitting in a meditative state with candles, at night to get into a good state of mind. But now it's the next day at your work and someone's getting really upset and someone's energy is really intense and you're feeling it, right? Maybe someone's accusing you of something. Can you stay present when that energy is loud, right? When it's right in your visceral experience and learning how to actually navigate and maintain groundedness in the midst of that. That's the energy work that I think we're primarily here to experience. And I would say that my understanding now, again, not just from reasoning, but from experience outside the construct, that actually all the events of our lives are synchronistically arising to give us those opportunities to work with energy. And the same way that someone, in a soccer practice says, today we're going to work on free kicks or whatever, um, the different experiences of our lives give us that opportunity. And this is why when you read like the Dolores Cannon material or something, and there are people who remember choosing the architecture, being part of the group that chooses the architecture of the events of their next life, in that perspective, you choose hard things because that's the whole point of coming here. And a life that's too comfortable, too easy with no drama, no intensity is mostly seen as a wasted opportunity from that other perspective. Because from that other perspective, you have all the time in the world to sit around doing nothing and just being at peace. And so you come here for the dramatic experience
Mhm.
of duality.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Going back to the Tibetan cosmology, there's a level that you can get to that's somewhere between getting out of the circle of samsara, pardon me, into the demigod or god realm or goddess realm. And yes, supposedly it's very easy to become complacent and
Right.
take things for granted. But going back to what you were saying about we start off this life thinking this is all there is, and then gradually we get some perspective and are able to zoom out a little bit. I think there's another outcome of that too, where people sort of stagnate in that first stage and they think that this is they sort of settle into this being all that there is. Their menu becomes very tiny, and they just sort of are spoon-fed what they're told, about reality, same shit, different day, that kind of perspective, it's not a good scenario. They're not happy, and they don't seem to think that there's any other way that they can be, or that they're being realistic. Like, I hate hate is a strong word, but I dislike when people go, "You know, I'm not cynical, I'm realistic." It's like, "Okay, tell me all about it."
Right. Right. Right.
But yeah, I
Yeah.
think a lot of people stagnate in that sense and just, they can become hedonistic or just become apathetic.
Yeah, and actually, I'm glad you brought that up because this brings to mind another aspect of the Dolores Cannon corpus, because there are people who access memories of different lifetimes, and one of the aspects that comes up, in addition to the UFO phenomenon and the sense that there's different kinds of beings interacting with us, there's also this additional sense that different human beings had different backgrounds. And not everyone here, speaking of the cycle of samsara, not everyone here has always been a human and has just been working through the karmic, flow and debt of a cycle of human experience. That
Yeah.
some people actually are coming in from a different kind of experience altogether. Some completely, mostly non corporeal, actually. And what sometimes happens is people will actually notice that there's a tremendous amount of drama happening on planet Earth right now, that this kind of draws a lot of attention because of the consciousness storms that are going on right now and the transition that we're going through in the midst of all this complexity and incoherence sometimes as well. And that draws people's attention. And some beings, as the understanding goes, volunteer to come in, incarnate as a human being so as to help with that transition. And it might not be something specific in terms of what they do. It just might be that their presence holds a kind of frequency that changes the possibility space. So they're a node of consciousness and a network of consciousness that subtly makes it more likely that one thing will happen over another, for instance. But what's interesting is in those traditions, there are times where even when a being is coming from a very, exalted kind of place where they have developed a lot of consciousness awareness and non-dual awareness, will come up back into what I call the brutality of duality, right? In this dense kind of layer, and they will forget. They will forget. They will never wake up. So that because this is, of course, one of the aspects of the lore and the traditions is that you voluntarily choose to surrender your greater awareness so that you can come on and have the real experience, right? And but a potential casualty in that is that the density so overwhelms you that you get small, like you talk about, that you kind
Mhm.
of diminish yourself. You start believing the hype and
Yes.
believe this is all there is. And so it's not just people who are still caught up in dense karma that don't necessarily wake up. It's people who've come from a more exalted place and actually regress when they come into this. So
Mhm.
I think it's something that, is one of the risks that you entail in taking on this particular incarnation.
Yeah, yeah, God. Have you ever seen the David Cronenberg movie Existence?
I don't think I have. I've
Uh,
always wanted to, but I don't think I have
oh,
actually.
I highly suggest it. It's a very good metaphor for exactly what we're talking about.
Mm,
And I'm tempted to wanna go into it, but I don't wanna spoil any of it. But let's just say people get involved in this very, sort of a virtual reality game, but not involving goggles. It taps into your brain, and you think that you're going through a certain experience, and then, at the end of the game, you come out and you've forgotten that you were in a game. You were so embroiled in it, and then you kind of come to, and you're in the room sitting next to the person that was in the game with you. It's really wonderful.
right.
Yeah, so if you stumble across it, I would highly suggest that you see it.
I will for sure. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Okay, let's see. Something I would also like to get into is the afterlife. And that's kind of a funny way of putting it too, because that's like that's something separate than what we're going through right now, and how we
Right.
call death the dying of our physical body, basically. But there's so much more to that. How have all of these experiences shaped the way that you see that state?
I'm glad you asked that because it has pretty profoundly changed it in a way I was not expecting, actually. And this is something I would actually point out to people who might be skeptical is some people might say, well, it's just wish fulfillment. You're just having an experience that's basically just, supporting what you already want to believe. But many of these revelations were not at all what I was expecting. And we tend to, like you say, because we're so bound and modulated into this experience of being a body mind, our main focus is, does this survive? What aspect of this survives? And what does it look like? What does that architecture look like? And we have the notion of going to a paradisal realm because we're still used to realms and we're still used to places and we just think it's a nicer place with waterfalls and all those kinds of things. Um, but my experience was that the entire human experience, of which the what we call the afterlife and the karmic cycle, was all well downstream of where I ended up going, the state of being I ended up being in. And so we tend to go at the very top of the ladder is this afterlife realm, and then you cycle back in, and eventually perhaps you transcend this. But my sense was that was all one movement, actually, and that the way that we separate those out is again illusory. And you have this sense of being not just a being who's having the experience of multiple human lifetimes and then being part of the council that architects the next experience and puts together very specific experiences that will let you work on specific energetic equations you want to work on. Just like if someone says, "Hey, will you come play tennis with me? I want to work on my forehand." Same thing in how we set up the events of our lives. But you also experience yourself as being the infrastructure that supports that kind of experience. And you experience yourself as being the overseeing architects that manage entire reality scapes so that that particular kind of experience set can emerge and be experienced. So you're experiencing all of those things at the same time. And it's not even strange or discombobulating to have that experience any more than it is to say, "Okay, right now, are you your left arm or your eye or your ear or your foot?" And you're like, "Well, I'm
Mhm.
all those things simultaneously."
Yeah.
Same sort of idea. Um, so I know a lot of people, really wrestle with it's bizarre to me when I come across this because it's so beyond my experience now, but I understand that a lot of people here worry about dying. They worry about, being snuffed out and their consciousness is gone. Um, Not only am I as convinced as one possibly could be that that's not the case, but I'm aware that even that is actually just part of the program, part of the construct. Like,
Mhm.
in other words, that's the way I have described it, is that the afterlife realm, as we understand it, is part of the same construct. It's still a construct, which is to say a very specific kind of constrained reality. It's not a false reality, it's a constrained reality, again, taking certain ingredients to create a certain experience set. And the way that the afterlife is part of the foundation of the lives that we live, right? It's you can't see it as separate from it because in a way it's more like there's a gradient, right? When you see a rainbow and someone says, "Show me exactly where red is and where green is," or something, you really can't because it's a gradient and one, slowly where is blue and green, one end and the one start. The same way that you can draw lines sort of arbitrarily, but somewhat artificially and say, "This is who Darren is," but in a much more true way, I am all these things simultaneously, and it's only where I zoom, right? It's like you take a microscope, and at first you don't see anything, you just see a petri dish that looks completely clean. Then you zoom in and you see all these microscopic kind of things moving around. You zoom in another layer, and it's like now many, many of them doing it. Um, and reality is like that. And not just reality, but our sense of who we are is basically constrained into existence based on whatever zoom level we're at, because that sets the parameters, and then I call like an echolocation. We send out a signal trying to figure out who we are, and the echo we get back from that particular zoom tells us who we think we are. But when you have these experiences outside the construct, all those echoes fall away because the boundaries are gone, and then you just understand yourself very differently. So So the afterlife is absolutely real, just as real as this is, and this is a virtual reality, just like it's a virtual reality, and it's purposeful. It's being chosen by us and other aspects of us at a higher level and other beings that are in association with us. This is something else I think will be confusing to some people, but when you have the experience, it's just infinite zoom, right? It's just infinite zoom. When you're in an electric car, you don't switch gears, right? You just hit the accelerator and you just keep going faster and faster and faster and faster. You don't actually change gears. It's the same notion here. And so I have also had experiences where I'm part of not just an oversoul, which sort of is comprised of all the different lives I've lived, but then kind of a conglomeration of oversouls that are related, so that sometimes I will meet people and have a familiarity that I think ties to that, right? And you've probably heard about this. People will not only have an important experience with someone in a lifetime, but they'll have this sense that they've been doing it over multiple lifetimes with each other,
Mhm.
and sometimes playing different roles.
Yeah.
One time you're a son, the next time you're the father or the grandfather or whatever. I think that those are all purposefully done so that we can play all the positions on the field and learn more about the totality of the game as a result.
And I've heard of soul clusters or soul families that uh, will sort of incarnate in the vicinity of one another to keep working on specific things. Does that concept ru- pan out to you at all? Does that make sense?
It does,
Yeah.
and in the same way that when we try to evaluate how the symbiotic functioning of an environment, we realize again, you have many, 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 many different kinds of subbiomes within biomes, right? And depending on how much you magnify, you can notice an entire different symbiotic network at different levels of life. And yet they're also interacting as well. And this is something else I recognize. Not only does it hold true that we are working out those experiences, including, by the way, people who end up looking like the enemies in this lifetime sometimes or are foes, um, are actually playing a particular kind of role of resistance. Just like when someone says, someone's going to hand me the ball, I'm going to run, will you block? Right? Like, just someone takes that role of being the blocker, which we here experience as something we don't like and someone who's trying to stop us. But again, that's resistance training. We go to a gym and lift weights that are deliberately heavy, so we will break down our muscles and form, stronger muscles. Same kind of notion, but in an energetic kind of sense. But in addition to that, as I think many people are familiar with that kind of idea, something else you become fundamentally aware of right away is that all of these realities are also biomes within biomes within biomes, and that every action we take here has implications or ramifications in all these other reality scapes. And because fundamentally, when you were speaking about astral journeys and, be aware of your intention, the truth is that's just as true here. We just don't see the
Yeah.
direct correlate of it.
Yes.
So I say to people, it's not just that you were thinking that thought, but thankfully you didn't voice it.
Hmm.
It's just holding the thought itself, entertaining the thought is causal. It's
Yes.
causing things to happen. And
Exactly.
and furthermore, I mean, there's many, many of these different experiences I've had, and it really is astonishing how many different layers of reality you become aware of and how they're all interacting. But as you probably heard about with Bob Monroe, and he talked about this notion of loosh,
Yes.
that there are entities that I've experienced who, in a symbiotic sense, consume the energy that we basically gas out with our emotions. And furthermore, just like we have learned how to grow tomatoes that are bigger and redder so that people will pick them at the grocery store, different kinds of energetic intelligences, just like there's all these microorganisms in our gut that actually influence us in ways that we're not conscious of. There are other symbiotic agents that are aware of how we get worked up, and they know how to tweak that just a bit. They don't cause it, but they can augment it. They can amplify those things so to create a kind of crop energetically that they consume. Some consume positive love and connection, other ones consume negativity and hatred, uh, and I have seen how there are these, when sometimes people in this reality, I think, struggle even more recently with the direction of our civilization, and many people feel like there's been some kind of regression. And I think some people wrestle with, wouldn't we just all kind of get together and figure stuff out and make better decisions for all of us? And yet it doesn't seem to happen. Well, in addition to all the people and the complexity involved in that and the different worldviews and stages of consciousness, there's also, it's very clear to me because I've experienced it, other energetic movements that are streaming into this reality that end up in the same way that, if you have a headache and so you act a bit more irritable than you normally would. These are not things you experience as a headache, but they're subtly tweaking your biology and your physiology in ways that will amplify your behavior one way or another to suit that agenda. But it's all symbiotic, right? We might want to say, well, that's negative, and sometimes it is from our perspective, but it behooves us, I have found, to really do something that our society has not taught us at all how to do, which is how to do this energetic inventory and how to become incredibly granularly self-aware about every moment. What am I experiencing right now? What's going through my body? How am I processing that thought? Am I letting go of that thing that happened earlier in the day or last week? Or am I, am I worrying about the future? Whatever. These things go far beyond the boundaries of the self because the boundaries of the self are largely porous and illusory to begin with, right? So, in the and so the, that's why it's so important to remember that this is a presentation layer. So you might think, well, you've got your stereo turned to a certain volume, but you've got walls and a door behind you, so it's not going to go out into the hallway. Well, in the deeper reality, those doors and that wall is not real, right? So everything you emit goes everywhere, and so you see all this symbiotic kind of ecosystem taking place, and it makes you care about not just what happens here, but how the actions you're entertaining or enacting impact others, and it makes you much more conscientious of just how much of a co-author you are, and it makes you take seriously that role because it's fundamental, actually.
Absolutely, I totally agree.
Yeah.
I think that's one of the confusing things about media, especially mass media, is because it can broadcast an idea or a series of ideas, and many people don't we're not we don't tend to be voyagers or discoverers. We're not out pressing on the outer envelopes of reality and the world, testing things out for ourselves very often. We're usually just listening to other people's reports about what what we're supposed to think about where we're at, you know? Uh,
Right.
and that is not only too convenient, but it's not real in the sense that it doesn't have anything to do with your personal experience of the world or reality, for a lack of a better term. So I think that that can play a big part in people who tend to live a passive existence, basically taking in that sort of stimulation or lack thereof. Um, and they are told what's on the menu and what's not on the menu. So instead of testing that and going out and going, I don't know if I buy that. I'm going to go out and try that myself. They just go, okay, whatever you say. So
Right.
that is makes it very easy, I think, for, something like a TV program or a radio show or something like that. As much as it can enlighten, it can also in some ways sort of anesthetize us to our existence. Do you feel that
Right.
way?
I do, absolutely, and like you say, people, I think again of Neo in The Matrix where, he realizes he has no strength and then, they tell him Morpheus tells him, "It's because 'cause you've never used your muscles actually in real life."
Yeah.
In a similar way, because we live in the modern world where, yeah, people are used to consuming media to tell them what reality is, and the second that we're born, people are feeding us a certain notion of what we are, and there isn't this strong sense of, well, reality is many things, go and work with it and see what makes sense to you and see what's true, kind of like a Buddhist, test it to see yourself. And so people eventually don't even realize that they're not even using their real muscles anymore. They're just, being force fed things, and they've lost so much sensitivity that they don't know what sensitivity is anymore at all.
Yeah.
And I think as well, when we are sort of propagandized into thinking, well, the only thing you wanna do is don't get sick, don't become poor, don't die, you know? Like, and so we think, "Okay, as long as I, keep those things at bay, I'm okay." But, um, but then we lose all that sense of the visceral vitality of life, and one thing that came to me very strongly when I came back from my first one of these protocol uses in Christmas of 2025 was this sense that, okay, number 1, this is not real in the way we think it's real, it's relatively real. But secondly, I refuse to navigate by fear anymore at all, because it's a dreamscape
Yeah.
that I'm choosing to have a particular experience. So what a boring way to live. It's like playing a video game and going, "I'm just gonna go over in the corner here and, like, hope that nothing gets me."
Yeah.
And people are like, "That's what you're gonna do the whole time?" "Yep." And we think this is somehow different than that, but it's really not.
Yeah, exactly. And fear
Yeah.
is what it's all about. I mean, that's what uh, sells news, for instance. And it's not, they're not telling about how positive things are and how people are working together. They're giving you a version of the world that seems scary and makes you want to buy what they're selling in a literal sense and a metaphorical sense too. Yeah, it's so interesting. But I was, talking about zooming in and zooming out. It made me think of when I was a child, and people who have heard this podcast, will have heard me talk about this experience, but w sort of a thought experiment that I would do when I was a child was, okay, people are telling me that God created existence, created the world, created human beings, but who created God? But then who created whoever created God? And then just taking that back and zooming out and somehow and it can still, if I sit and ponder that, it can still I mean, not that I believe in a God, but, that's just a framework to put a much larger idea in. I can still almost work myself up to an altered state of mind because it somehow shows me how not only intricate it all is and how multifaceted it is, but how small of a part I am in that. Not insignificant, but just small. Um, and I just had within the last year, about a year ago, actually, I had my first kind of intense DMT experience, something that I've studied about because I've been an admirer of Terence McKenna since the early 90s. And he's talked on and hours and hours about this DMT, and I'm like, "What is this all about?" I wanna experience this myself. And I've heard that you need to at least take 2 to 4 very deep hits, and, I only got to 1, and that shift in reality came very, very quickly, and I'm like, I'm not sure I wanna go any further than this." But the effect that it had on me was very strange. It Many people talk about diving into a huge space and there's entities that they interact with and there's like all of this expanse, but I felt like I had been shrink wrapped. I felt like something just sucked the air out of the room and it was a very disconcerting feeling. Like I had to struggle to just remember to breathe. And, it was very, very disconcerting. So I recovered from that. I went out and talked to my wife about it, and I'm not sure what I just experienced, but it was not it was not shooting out of my body into this realm of where people wanna show me stuff.
Right.
And I'm simplifying it, of course. But that set off a series of states of mind that were the opposite of zooming out. They were zooming in. I zoomed into myself so much that I became self-conscious of breathing, needing to breathe. Uh,
Mm.
I became very claustrophobic. The one day I was, having lunch at work, and I just started thinking about dying, and, like, I'm gonna not be here anymore, and I became terrified, mortally terrified, which is very unusual. Usually, I'm very open-minded about that, but it had the reverse effect on me, and I'm still recovering from that. I feel much better, but it was very, very strange, a very strange labyrinth that I got lost in for a while. Needless to say, I'm not going to revisit that. I'm not even gonna try and get past that experience, but what are your have you done any sort of psychedelics or altered states of mind, and how do they relate to where you've, gone without the aid of any of that?
Yeah, I have, and, yeah, my experiences have been positive, and my experiences have been expansive,
Cool.
and, I have had, experiences where I felt some of the physiological aspect you're talking about, where until you kinda, like, pop out, into the altered state, your body begins to feel pretty intense. There've been times where I felt or heard noise in my ears that's pretty intense, and I felt a pressure in my head. Um, but because I've always passed through that, and then I'm kind of in the expanse, so it's sort of like that's the wormhole you're going through to get into the, greater cosmos. I'm familiar enough with that now that I do literally remind myself, "Just breathe," until you sort of pop through it, and, so yeah, I've had profound experiences with that, and even with, plant medicine, psychedelics, I've had experiences where, even there, my experience of time changes where and not just time, but also there's a sense, and this is talked about again in non-dual circles, that this is primarily where any human language to some degree fails because certain notions like subject and object and tense are built into our language. They assume those things have to be there as the building blocks of reality. But what you experience is the happening without a doer. There is no doer. There's just the unfolding of what's happening in the environment. And in that moment, you can at first go halfway and go, wow, it's like I'm operating at the speed of the environment. So I would look as an insect, a really tiny insect with suddenly have really hypervision on the psychedelic, and I can see it with incredible clarity, but I look as it's landing. It's not even split second it lands and then I look, like, I'm looking as it's landing, like, because I am the environment, right? So, this is where I say it's not that anything's been added, it's actually something has been loosened, right? Something's been taken away. What was taken away is the filters that usually constrain me into a certain kind of experience, and so in that moment, I begin to recognize that the events that unfold and my awareness of them are two aspects of the same thing. And there is no subject and object. There is no tree that's separate from me, right? And again, it's fascinating because a friend of mine, Yossi Ronan from Israel, who had a really profound experience where he first encountered these playful beings that were aliens of some sort in a dream state, and he found it quite playful and he enjoyed it. Then he woke up in his brother's apartment in LA and heard uh, noise in the front room, went into the front room, and they were there in his waking state now,
Wow.
and he had a very different reaction, right? Like,
Yeah.
visceral fight or flight kicks in,
Yes.
but then he had a third aspect of the reality or the experience where afterwards, he would go outside and see a tree, and he was no longer able to separate the tree from the sunlight, from the soil, from the oxygen, right? It was all just one unfolding, right? And I think here about David Bohm and the implicate and the intricate order, right? And that everything here is just the unfolding of um, something that is more primarily just one movement. And so on psychedelics, I've had that experience of being the movement. And and this is where it's really important to become very you let go of as many of your assumptions as you can. And so one of them, instead of going, "Oh, I'm operating I have super speed now and I know when things are gonna happen," instead you go, "No, there is no environment in me. I just am the environment. I'm just the unfolding of everything." And It takes a while to get there because we become so habituated into assuming there's subject object,
Mhm.
but there really isn't, and that is what the nature of that experience is.
So you think I should have just taken another hit?
Well, it's interesting, like, different people have tried different things and have different experiences with them. The one time I tried DMT, I had a difficulty with it only because I never smoked, and so I wasn't able to ingest it. It was kind of caustic in my throat, and I kept
Yeah.
like losing it again. So I find other kinds much easier to ingest. Um, Yes, but I think it would be interesting to pursue that further, and again, it becomes interesting to think about trying to meditate on what might have been your setting that when it interacted with it, went into
Yeah.
that wrap experience, right?
Yes.
The shrink wrapping as opposed to the expansiveness, and it
Mhm.
might have just been a subtly different posture that you had, so
Yeah.
it'd be interesting to meditate on that.
I agree. Once I work up the courage, I actually might attempt to do that again, but, um, yeah, I was wondering that too, but it set off a chain of events, that was just like I didn't I don't think I asked for, at least consciously, but they were just sort of like different psychological levels of claustrophobia, and I felt that
Right.
claustrophobic in my timeline, claustrophobic spiritually, claustrophobic physically, very strange, very unlike me. So, yeah, but you're right. It could have been, a nudge to the left or right, and it would have been a completely different experience.
Yeah, because we do prime the experience even if we're not conscious that we're doing it.
Yeah.
And again, to just speak about what we said about before, about caution and just thoughtfulness, I have a friend who had an experience where the very first time he used psilocybin, he decided to go for it, and I think took something like 3 or 4 grams his first time, and only later on found out that he had some sort of really rare physiological condition, which increases the sensitivity of something like psilocybin by like 100 times.
Oh,
And so
shit.
he literally had the visceral experience of being stuck in a kind of purgatory state for hundreds of years
Wow. Oh my
and then
god.
came out. And his life was very disrupted afterwards. His relationship ended, he lost his business, went into debt. I mean, so, these realities are so real that they can completely unmoor you when you come back. So, you want to, be methodical, um, start small, right? See how your body reacts. If you have something like a negative experience, meditate on it, try a different approach, and approach it methodically and carefully because, um, these are our other realities. They're
Yes.
not just it's not PlayStation time,
Mhm.
and even when we're not aware of it, we are priming the experience in different ways.
Yeah, I definitely was approaching it with respect because after reading all of that with, Terrence and the way that he spoke of it, I did not enter lightheartedly, for sure. I
Right.
also had a ayahuasca experience that, was not that way at all, but I think that I did try and keep one foot in this world. I would probably go further the next time I did it if that opportunity presents itself, but I was able to see the potential of that and pretty mind-blowing stuff. Let's see, okay, uh, keeping on the afterlife here for just a little bit longer, what do you think, I'm sure you've heard of life reviews.
Yeah.
What do you feel that that is? Did you ever encounter anything remotely like that in your experiences?
So in terms of what it is, I would first say that because this is purposeful and because we come here to have the experience of working with energy, which ends up being manifested in the different things we see and the events of our lives, the experience of people, right? And one of the things again I talk about in my classes is that um, we will really help ourselves if we can stop lumping life into the good events and bad events. Right? We're sort of preconditioned to do that and try to maximize one and minimize the other. And And you end up with this notion, to speaking what we said about before about being kind of diminished and small, is we're just trying to evade the worst from happening or something. We're just trying to survive life rather than thriving. Um, and so one thing I say is I really ask people to meditate on, do you experience that life is happening to you or arising for you? And there's no right or wrong answer. I always talk about practicing radical transparency because you're here to have the experience and learn. So, to whatever degree you obfuscate yourself from the truth, you're only negatively impacting your own experience and what you came here for. And there is no right or wrong answer, but it's just a way to really come to grips with your current relationship with reality. And I say this a lot too, that it's not so much that reality is hard or easy, it's our relationship to reality is hard or easy, and so that's an interpretation of what's happening. And most of us, when we look back at the events that have most shaped us and most made us who other people would say we uniquely are in terms of a substance of character, it's usually the things we put in the bad box that
Hmm.
produce that kind of character in us, right?
Yes.
And so again, you have to ask yourself, so am I here just to try to skate through and have as little negative happen as possible and then die? Like, is that what you want? Is that what you want? And if it is, fine. But a lot of people, I think, don't ever get to that granularity of really asking why I'm here. And so they end up defaulting to, I'm just going to try to mostly play it safe. Right. And like you say, I'll just act based on what people say to me and what I'm told about reality.
Yeah.
Um, and so I think with the life review, getting to what I said before about many people in retrospect realize that the uneventful, peaceful, easy lives were the biggest wasted opportunities because the whole point of setting up these experiences, mostly of resistance, right? What I would call catalyst, is so that we can have the experience of learning how to work with energy. And so the ones where we choose the events that are easier and lighter end up from the other perspective seeing like a wasted experience. What I find fascinating about the life review is not just the fact that you re-experience your life in a split second every moment of your life, but actually what usually happens is your consciousness is expanded. So an action you've taken, you experience everybody in the room how they experience the
Yes.
action you took, right? The
Yeah.
person you said that thing to, even the person you thought that thing about. And people that you hadn't even thought about in the next room who overheard it and actually felt like their body getting constricted because they could feel the negativity. And so you begin to be reintroduced to the notion that it's all connected, and you understand the environmental impact, if you will, in the most expansive way of understanding environmental of your actions in a way that you have not been aware of before. And I think then in the next life, you have some memory of that, but it's not conscious memory. It's not biographical memory. "Oh, yeah, I remember last time I did this to Uncle Henry, and I regretted that afterwards." It's more like just a subtle sensibility that things don't seem quite as separate or you're more other aware than you were before. And so that much more subtle awareness, which again, it's not when you're outside of it, it's not linear, right? Because of that, when you come back in, a lot is lost in translation, but you do still have this deep-seated kind of when people talk about like an old soul, right? An old soul is something that seems to understand some of the social dynamics in a way that other people don't, even at a young age. So I think that what's fascinating about the life reviews is not just that it's about a person, you know, it's not about paying a price or judgment. One of the things that people are most often surprised by, especially people who come from sort of a monotheistic tradition, is you realize there was no God judging me. It was just me assessing my own journey. And not just assessing it, but assessing it in light of the intentions I had before I came in. So that's a really fascinating way of looking at the whole experience. And then you realize, though, that even that is a porous boundary. And the oversoul that you are as well is learning from all of the experiences of your life. And that even those, and even the notion of a past life is actually a way that we frame it here. When I've been outside the construct, they're all related to each other. The same way I talked about AI stores information multidimensionally in different places. So it can hold the nature of that relationship, not just lump them together in one line. Same thing with different lifetimes. And they too are happening simultaneously. Truly, right? I mean, simultaneous is a temporal term. It's about as close as we can get here. So it's fascinating. It's not as simple as, one life impacts the next. It's more complicated than that. It kind of looks that way when we map it here. But it's fascinating because of what it teaches us, how we are reminded that we actually are impacting the entire environment, and we actually are the environment. And you realize that all these things bubble up. So every action and every lesson learned by every action of every instantiation of partitioned consciousness benefits every other partitioning of consciousness right up to the most subsuming kind of layer.
Mhm. Yeah, that's beautiful, beautiful way of putting it. Sometimes I look around physical reality at institutions and organizations and stuff like that, and I see the reasons that they were established, usually, often to try and do good things in the world. But sometimes I see things like that, even buildings, even anything that's static or seems static, is almost like ideas, some of them good, some of them bad, sort of frozen in time, and we use them as reference points to point to and to maybe hopefully launch to the next lily pad or to go, well, we've always done it this way, you know. So it becomes like a tether that keeps us from evolving. What are your thoughts about like I don't know. This is the first time I've really even thought about this. This is not on my list of questions, but the artifacts of physical reality affecting, like, do they hold us back? Do they need to hold us back? Are they just how do you view those
Mm.
sorts of things?
Yeah, and I think a lot about this because, there's this expression I remember hearing before when I was younger and liking it, which is that we choose our habits, uh, or we decide our habits, and then our habits decide who we become, basically, right? So there's a sense that we set the initial conditions, but then there will be downstream impacts of those conditions.
Yeah,
And that's also true at the meta level as a civilization. And when you go to other places in other parts of the world and they structure their cities differently and whatnot, and they structure their working hours differently. And you go to Spain and or some parts of South America, and they have a couple hours in the afternoon when everybody just hangs out and drinks tea or coffee or something. Here we just go, oh, all this productivity we're missing out on here, and then you ask yourself, productivity towards what, right? And this incessant need to constantly increase GDP and how we are demanding infinite growth in a world with finite resources in this
exactly.
construct,
Yes,
and that those are not sustainable kind of equations. And yet the kind of inertia that we develop culturally becomes so self-serving and takes on a life of its own, almost like an egregore or a tulpa, that we can't get off the train, even though we can kind of see the train's going to hit a mountain up ahead. We still can't get off, and we create market conditions that will never select for the overall benefit of the fullness of creation. For instance, it will only benefit increasing monetary load or something, so we can keep instantiating this growth year after year after year, and all the ways that that has major impacts. And furthermore, when you have obfuscated people from their deeper selves and convinced them that, just being able to stream Netflix or doom scroll on their phone or have cheap junk food is the good life, then you just end up creating a system that produces more and more of that. And people are more and more obfuscated from their deepest natures and don't even know how to evaluate what the good life is anymore. And, when they're constantly fed commercials that tell them, if you get the new iPhone, you'll be much happier. And they don't know any way to believe differently about that. These all have massive impacts. And I've been thinking a lot about this and recently been just trying to grapple with that aspect because I'm both really interested in helping people to cultivate deep, deep self-awareness at the energetic level that I'm talking about, this kind of evaluation of all the ways that energy is passing through you and that you're passing energy into the world, but also collectively, like you talk about our institutions, our policies, our unspoken assumptions, and all of the implications of that. And kind of wanting to marry those because I often see organizations and people who are very interested in environmental policy and those consequences and how much we're impacting the biosphere, how many, species are going out of existence every year. And as long as it doesn't stop GDP, we don't think it's a problem. Um, People, very viscerally experiencing climate change, and still somehow trying to obfuscate, some of the reasons behind it, or not even really being willing to even have the conversation about what might be causing it. Um, so I think about a lot of these things and how there's a kind of collective madness at the heart of modern civilization, um, and it's the reason why it keeps unfolding is a combination of all those things. When you have trained people away from self-awareness, when you have, propagandized people out of a deep somatic awareness, a visceral somatic experience of themselves as a part of the environment, they lose the ability to, be in touch with how the environment's doing because they're no longer doing that. When you go to a supermarket and buy food that's produced somewhere else in a factory farm or whatever, you have no visceral way to touch that. So you not only can't produce the empathy, but you also aren't aware of all the ways that the environment's impacted because it's obfuscated from your awareness. So I think with all these things, but also as even that being downstream of these kind of energetic movements I've talked about that I've experienced coming into this reality. So I think some people that think everything that happens here is only having causes here will sometimes struggle with why do we not seem to do better? Why are we not able to come together and get along or um, move past the need for nuclear weapons or something? And I think a lot of it has to do with education and sociology, but there's also this need to be aware of and teach people to cultivate um, energetic awareness of movements that are coming in that are not physical, that you can't point to, with your physical eyes
Yes.
and that don't show up at policy meetings, but inevitably influence policy in ways it's not being gauged for.
Mhm. Yeah, I was gonna say we have sort of a collective, obsession with tangibility, like something we can quantify and weigh and
Right.
measure, and
Measure,
it's
yeah.
yeah, those things that are elusive to those categories are what we can't systemize in a way that, you know, or make money off of or anything like that. Nobody benefits except the individual on self-improvement and self-awareness and, getting to know the self, know thyself, That's it seems like our most of our society is very outward pointed. We look to other people
Yeah.
for our happiness. We look to objects for happiness. We look to situations, optimal situations for happiness, completely missing the point is to be happy no matter where you're at, under what no matter what circumstances you're under, because that's
Right.
where the real responsibility happens, real accountability is being able to maintain that awareness that will help you navigate through life's turbulence sometimes, in a way that's graceful and you come out the other side better for it.
Right, and are you contributing to the turbulence or reducing the turbulence, right?
Yes.
Like, when people think about world peace and things, and they think about that also as kind of a tangible thing you measure, like fewer wars or something, but something like fewer wars is downstream of inner turbulence and social turbulence, right? That precedes that before it erupts in an actual war, and, when we cultivate our lives, are we consciously doing that inventory. What is my energetic state right now? Well, I'm frustrated. What do you expect? This such and such happened. Okay, but that's the thing you have control over. You can't control traffic right now, but you can control your reaction to traffic. And furthermore, so it's the I-5 going into LA, and sure, you've got like, 30,000 people right now that are all fuming, right? I don't mean just their cars, I mean personally, right? And so that's changing the experience layer of the
Exactly.
collective organism, right? So, um, and to me, while I definitely think we need more conversation about deeper policy, if we continue to divorce it from energetic awareness, we will continue to go in circles to a large
Mhm.
degree, I think.
For
Yeah.
sure. Absolutely. As we are sort of rounding towards the 2-hour mark, perhaps you could let us know what, I don't know what you would call them, workshops, or what that you, the kinds of things that you do. What do those entail, and what happens during them?
Yeah. First thing I would say is that if people wanna look into what, retreats and workshops and classes are happening, they can look at my website, which is essenceofbeing.info, and there I will advertise which classes I'm doing, which are online classes, and then often, so far every year, the last 3 years, I've also put on a retreat, of which most of the people that attend those retreats are either coaching clients or people who've taken my classes, and I do that not to create an in-group or to be exclusionary, but it's because you create a certain kind of culture in those classes and people become familiar with the kind of ethos I'm trying to cultivate around radical transparency and openness and energetic awareness. And so people, even if they see themselves as individual, you know, squares on a screen, they get to have some sense of knowing each other. And then when we meet in person, it kind of has that three-dimensional dynamic. So usually every year I teach 1 or 2 classes in the kind of the spring semester and then again in the fall. So the next class I'll offer will be in the beginning of September going into November. And the last few years I've done 1 retreat every year. The first year was in Idaho, the second one was at Mount Shasta. And then just this year, a couple months ago, I did one in the Mojave Desert in California. And next year I'm looking to do one in Europe as well as one in North America. I'm planning to do other ones as well. And they're actually trying to help people experience a different way of being human together. It's one thing to contemplate it, but what I have found, the feedback I've had is that when you can go into a class where we're very intentionally trying to cultivate this in our lives and develop skillfulness around this, and then we come together having done that, the entire energetic dynamic of that group is very different. And people give feedback that they find it incredibly resonant and wonder, why are we not living this way? This, in comparison, suddenly normal life feels very one dimensional and to some degree purposeless. So I want to continue to cultivate ways to develop those skills in people and for people to experience community in a new way so we can kind of live into humanity 2.0. So yeah, coaching and classes and retreats, all three of those they can learn about on essenceofbeing.info.
And how many podcasts are you involved in?
I have 2 podcasts right now,
Okay.
so but both of those can be found on ExoAcademian. So I've kinda consolidated. So if you go onto the podcast networks, look for ExoAcademian, you'll find 1 week I do Liminal Frames, the next week I do Point of Convergence. Liminal Frames is a conversational podcast with my friend Nathan. Point of Convergence is kind of a solo podcast that I do. Um, yeah, so that's in ExoAcademian on the podcast networks and same thing on my YouTube channel.
Isn't there one other, I'm going to my podcast
There
catcher.
was. I had another one called Event Horizon, but
Yeah.
that's been on hiatus, yeah.
Okay.
So right now it's I will also do feature series for my Patreon members on different topics, but, so I alternate between Point of Convergence, Liminal Frames, and a feature series, but all of that is under ExoAcademian.
Yes, that makes it very easy. Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, that's what I listen to. It's fantastic stuff. And I think this is all good for people who are wanting to cultivate their self-awareness, and the people who realize that in order to change the world, which a lot of people do by getting into politics and working on policies or protesting or whatever, that's not, it doesn't, I don't think it works that way. I think it works from the inside out. We have to start inside. So many people do the outside stuff without doing the inside work to, I think, mixed results. I think your results are going to be a lot better if you start on the inside and reflect out.
Yeah, I completely agree, and I think while on the one hand, it's been fascinating for someone like me who was into consciousness studies and non-duality years before I got into the UFO phenomenon so centrally, it's been fascinating to see how many people for which the UFO phenomenon has become the gateway drug into consciousness
Yeah.
development and understanding.
Uh-huh.
But that said, um, while I understand it's exciting and dramatic to go join a CE5 group so you can see lights in the sky, and that's great and it's fun and we want to do that. Um, that alone and hoping that these other beings will just come in and solve our problems and take us into humanity 2.0 rather than recognizing we have to live into that. We have to be the embodiment. We have to become the change we seek. And so I think doing the deep inner work, doing the shadow work, taking seriously radical transparency. When people go to communicate with these beings, they will often say, what you eat, who you interact with, the energy you come with will impact whether or not we show up. That's just one metric, right? Now think about all the other metrics in our lives that are impacted by the way that we hold our energy. And so, my encouragement is that if we really want to see us join this larger community, of which a galactic community is just one dimension of it, because it's a multidimensional kind of reality, then we have to change our energetic nature so that we can host and be compatible with a different kind of resonance. And so that, I agree with you completely, begins within and then works out.
Fantastic. I love it, and we didn't really even get into the UFO
Yeah.
alien stuff, but maybe I can have you back and the next time we could go into that further, 'cause there's
Sure, yeah, that'd be
s
great, and it was fun to explore this other terrain because for me, that's where I spend a lot of my time, but I often actually usually get asked about the UFO stuff, so it's
Mhm.
nice to have the alternative for a change. Yeah.
Good, good. We'll make that the second time that we get together, so thank you so much, Darren, for agreeing to do this. It's been great to have a conversation with you and delightful to listen to your podcast. I always come out of there with a lot more than I came in. Very informative and again, very well articulated. It's a relief to hear somebody that actually takes it seriously and is able to see the application to the self and to consciousness and to the greater reality of things. So yeah, you bridge a lot of things that I'm interested in and kind of bring them all under one umbrella in a way that I really works for me. So I highly suggest your podcast to anybody listening or watching out there.
Well,
Um,
thank you, Chris. I appreciate it, and I thank you for the interview and for the nature of the questions you asked because it went in directions that I think are really important, and, I can tell you're operating at a similar wavelength, so it's good to meet, kindred spirits in
yeah,
this space.
likewise.
Yeah.
And I'm going to look into some of the groups that you have going on and see if one of them I can insinuate myself into, and because it
Right,
sounds
right,
like they're a group of people that I would probably really relate to. So,
right.
all right,
Beautiful.
Darren, thank you, and I will be in contact and let you know when this comes out.
Beautiful. I
All right.
appreciate it. Alright.
Yes. Have a
Alright.
wonderful rest of your evening.
You too, Chris.